He was 17, and he thought he knew the shape of winter. He had grown up in the Nebraska bottomlands, where the cold came honestly and left the same way, and he believed that a river, once frozen, stayed frozen until spring did the work of releasing it. That belief would have killed him if the old man had not been stranger than the town could tolerate. The old man's name was Ashel Vane, and by the autumn of 1874, he had lived on the west end of the Loup for close to 40 years, longer than any white man in the county, and longer than most of the Pawnee, who still remembered when the fort had been a trading post. He had a way of standing at the edge of the water in the last hour of daylight, holding a length of blackened willow in his left hand and tapping the ice with it in a slow rhythm that no one had ever asked him to explain. He tapped once, waited, tapped twice, waited longer, and then walked home without looking back. The boys in town called it his weather praying. The men called it worse. The young man's name was Corwin Hale, and he had come to live with Ashel Vane in September of that year, because his mother had died in August, and there was no one else. Ashel was his mother's uncle by a marriage that had ended in another century, and the arrangement was more custom than affection. Corwin brought a bedroll, a good knife, and the certainty that he would leave by spring. Ashel gave him a bunk in the loft above the smokehouse, and a single instruction on the first night, spoken across the coals of a low fire: listen to the river before you listen to anyone in town. Corwin nodded, because it was easier than answering. He did not intend to listen to either. The cabin sat above the Loup on a shelf of packed earth. Ashel had cut himself in 1837, and it was the sort of place that made a young man restless within a week. Every tool hung in a specific place. Every jar in the root cellar faced a label out. The old man split his kindling into 3 lengths and stacked each length in its own crib against the north wall, and when Corwin asked why, Ashel only said, "Because I will need them in that order," and did not explain further. By the second week of October, the town of Larkspur Ford was already talking about the crossing. The Loup ran shallow there, 30 yards wide at the ford, and no deeper than a man's waist, even in high water, and the freight wagons that came down from the Dakota trade had used it since before the town had a name. The first freeze had come early that year, on the 9th of October, and by the 15th the surface of the river held a skin of ice thick enough to bear a walking man. The freighters were pleased. An early hard freeze meant an early wagon crossing, and an early wagon crossing meant the winter goods would reach the settlement south of the Platte before the deep snows locked the roads. Ashel Vane went down to the fort on the 16th of October, tapped the ice with his willow stick, and told the first 3 men he met that the river would not be safe until the second week of December, no matter how cold the nights got in between. They laughed at him. Corwin, standing behind him with the mule's lead in one hand and a sack of oats in the other, laughed too. It was the first mistake he would spend the winter regretting. The man who laughed loudest was Ely Marston, who ran the freight office and had done so for 11 years. Marston was not cruel by nature. He was practical, and practicality on the frontier had a way of hardening into a kind of contempt for anything that could not be measured on a scale. He looked at Ashel's willow stick, at the black rag tied around its tip, and at the old man's weather-stained coat, and he said, loud enough for the loafers on the porch of the general store to hear, "Vane, if I waited on your almanac, I'd starve my family and yours. The ice is 4 inches. I've had a boy walk it twice this morning. We crossed Tuesday." The second mocker was younger, a freighter named Bertram Coyle, who had come down from Yankton the previous spring and had made himself popular by being cheerfully useless in every way that did not involve driving a team. Coyle did not laugh at Ashel the way Marston did. Coyle mimicked him. He picked up a piece of kindling from the woodpile behind the store, held it like a willow stick, and tapped the frozen mud of the street with a solemn face. "The mud says Thursday," he said. The mud is very clear on this point. The loafers on the porch laughed harder at Coyle than they had at Marston, because cruelty dressed up as comedy always travels farther than cruelty spoken plain. Corwin laughed with them. He was 17, and he wanted to be liked, and Bertram Coyle had a way of making a boy feel included that no amount of good sense could resist. Later, walking home behind the mule, Corwin told the joke again to himself, tapping his own knuckle against his thigh in imitation of the old man, and he was still smiling when Ashel spoke over his shoulder without turning around. When a river lies, Ashel said, it lies quietly. Remember that. Corwin stopped smiling. He did not know why the sentence bothered him. It bothered him for a long time. The lessons began the next morning, though Ashel never called them lessons. He called them chores, and he assigned them in the same flat voice he used for everything else. Corwin was to dig a trench 8 feet long and 3 feet deep on the north side of the cabin, following a line Ashel had marked with a length of tarred string. The trench was not for drainage. Ashel had already run drainage on the south side in 1841. The trench was to be filled, once dug, with a mixture of dry oak ash from the smokehouse and coarse river sand from a specific bar half a mile upstream. Corwin was to pack the mixture in layers, each layer no more than 4 inches deep, and he was to tamp each layer down with the flat side of a maul before adding the next. When he asked what the trench was for, Ashel said, "For the wall behind it," and walked away. The wall behind the trench was the north wall of the cabin. Corwin had seen it 100 times and had noticed nothing unusual about it. Now, looking at it after a full day of digging, he saw that it was not one wall, but 2, with a gap of perhaps 6 inches between them, and that the gap was filled with something dry and pale that shifted when he pressed a knuckle against the outer boards. Chaff. Wheat chaff, mixed with what looked like sawdust and something finer, packed so tight that the wall gave the impression of a single solid timber from a distance. "Why chaff?" Corwin asked that night, over a bowl of squirrel stew. "Because chaff does not conduct," Ashel said. "Conduct what?" "Cold." The old man lifted his spoon and looked at it as if he had never seen it before. "A living body loses heat 4 ways. Chaff stops 3 of them. The 4th is your own foolishness." Corwin did not ask which of the 4 his own foolishness qualified as. He suspected he already knew. The trench took him 9 days. On the 10th day, Ashel had him dig another one, this time on the east side, running perpendicular to the first. On the 15th day, when the 2 trenches met at the corner of the cabin, Ashel walked the whole length of them once, tapped the packed ash and sand at 3 specific points with the toe of his boot, and said, "It will do." Corwin waited for an explanation. None came. He learned, in that first month, that explanations from Ashel Vane were like games in a lean year. They existed, but you did not ask for them, and when they came, you were grateful, and you did not question the portion. The freighters crossed the Loop on the 21st of October. 6 wagons, 42 mules, and a boy of 12 named Isaac Marston walked ahead of the lead team with a long pole to test the ice. The crossing took an hour, and it was uneventful. The ice held. Marston stood on the north bank when it was done, and shouted something across to the men on the south side that Corwin, watching from the ridge above the ford with Ashel's field glass, could not quite make out. It sounded like a laugh. Ashel was not there. He was at the cabin, splitting the second length of kindling into the middle crib against the north wall. "They crossed," Corwin said, coming through the door with his cheeks stinging from the cold. "I know they crossed. The ice held. I know it held. You were wrong." Ashel did not look up from the kindling. He set another piece into the crib, adjusted it a quarter turn, and then said in the same flat voice, "I was not wrong. I was early. Those are different things." Corwin did not understand. He would understand, later, in a way that would not leave him for the rest of his life. The weeks that followed were the coldest anyone in Larkspur Ford could remember, and also the strangest. The temperature dropped to 16 below on the 1st of November and stayed there for a full week. Then, on the 8th, a warm wind came down from the southwest, a Chinook, the freighters called it, though the true Chinook belonged farther west, and the daytime temperature climbed to just above freezing for 3 days running. The ice on the loop did not visibly change. It looked the same from the bank. A man standing on it would have felt no different beneath his boots. Ashel went down to the ford each of those 3 days. He tapped the ice with his willow stick. He tapped it once, waited, tapped twice, waited, and then walked home. On the 3rd day, Corwin walked down with him and stood beside him and listened, and he heard nothing that seemed to mean anything. The ice made a small hollow sound under the stick. That was all. "What are you listening for?" Corwin asked. "For what is under the sound," Ashel said. "Not the sound itself. The thing beneath it. I don't hear anything beneath it." "You will." Ashel looked at him for the first time in what felt like days. "Or you will not, and then you will drown. One or the other." He said it without heat. He said it the way a man says the weather. Corwin walked home behind him with his hands in his pockets and a coldness in his chest that had nothing to do with the wind. On the 12th of November, Ely Marston announced that the freight company would run its second and largest crossing of the season on the 26th. 9 wagons this time, carrying flour, salt pork, iron stock, and 2 full crates of window glass, bound for the new hotel at Blue Springs. The ice, Marston said, had held through the warm spell and was now setting up again in the fresh cold. It would be 6 inches by the 26th easily. He had a boy check it every morning. Ashel went into town on the 15th of November, for the first time since October. He walked the length of Main Street with his willow stick under his arm. And he went into the freight office, and he stood in front of Ely Marston's desk, and he said, in a voice that Corwin, waiting outside with the mule, could hear through the shut door, "Do not cross on the 26th. The river is hollow. It has been hollow since the warm wind. The top is thick, and the bottom is thin, and there is water between them that has not yet found its way out. If you put 9 wagons on it, you will lose them all." Marston laughed. He did not laugh cruelly. He laughed the way a man laughs at a child who has said something both wrong and endearing. Corwin heard the laugh through the door, and he felt his own face flush, though he did not know whether the flush was for the old man or for himself. When Ashel came out of the freight office, Bertram Coyle was on the porch of the general store across the street, and he saw the willow stick, and he cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted, "Vane, tell my mud what day to plant the winter wheat." The loafers laughed. Corwin, holding the mule's lead, did not laugh this time, but he did not defend the old man either. He looked at the frozen mud of the street, and he said nothing, and Ashel Vane walked past him, and mounted the wagon seat, and waited until Corwin climbed up beside him. They rode home in a silence that Corwin would remember, later, as the loudest silence of his life. That night Ashel did something he had not done before. He took down a leather satchel from a peg above the mantel, and he opened it on the table, and he laid out its contents in front of Corwin one by one. There was a folded map, hand-drawn on oilskin, showing the loop from the fort down to the confluence with the Platte. There was a notebook bound in rawhide, its pages crowded with small square handwriting. There was a length of braided horsehair with knots tied in it at irregular intervals. There was a small iron rod, no thicker than a pencil, blackened at one end and bright at the other. And there was a single sheet of paper, folded twice, with a diagram on it that looked like the cross-section of a river with 3 layers marked and named. "You will need to know these things," Ashel said. "Not now, later. When I am not here to tell you." Corwin looked at the objects, and then at the old man. "Where are you going?" "Nowhere yet." But no man knows the day. Corwin wanted to laugh, because it was the sort of thing an old man said when he wanted to be serious. And a boy of 17 has a hard time accepting the seriousness of anyone over 60. But something in Ashel's face stopped him. He nodded instead, and he did not touch the objects. And after a long while, Ashel put them all back into the satchel, and hung the satchel on the peg and went to bed. Corwin lay awake in the loft above the smokehouse and listened to the small sounds of the cabin settling in the cold. He heard the packed ash in the trenches ticking as it contracted. He heard the chaff in the north wall shifting when the wind pressed against it. He heard once a low creak from the direction of the river, half a mile away, that he could not identify, and that he did not, at that hour, want to identify. He slept badly. The morning of the 17th of November was gray and windless, and Ashel Vane did not come out of his room at the usual hour. Corwin waited until the fire had burned down to coals, and then he went and knocked at the door. And when there was no answer, he opened it, and he found the old man sitting up in bed with his back against the wall, and his hands folded in his lap and his eyes open and not seeing anything. He had died in the night. There was no violence in it and no sign of struggle. He had died the way he had lived, which was quietly and on his own terms, and without asking anyone's permission. Corwin stood in the doorway for a long time. He did not weep, because weeping was not something the men of his family did, and also because the shock had not yet found its way through the layers of him. He closed the door, and he went outside, and he walked down to the river in the gray light, and he stood on the bank at the ford, and he looked at the ice. The ice looked the same as it had the day before. It looked solid. It looked like ice that had held 6 wagons, and would hold 9 more. Corwin took the willow stick out of the umbrella, stand by the cabin door, and he walked back down to the ford, and he tapped the ice the way he had seen Ashel tap it. Once. Wait. Twice. Wait longer. He listened. He heard the small hollow sound of the stick against the surface, and he heard the wind moving in the dry grass on the bank, and he heard a raven somewhere upstream calling twice and then falling silent, and beneath all of that he heard nothing. He walked home. He buried Ashel Vane on the shelf above the cabin, in ground that had been frozen for 3 weeks, and that took him a day and a half to break with a pick. He did not send for a preacher. There was no preacher in Larkspur Ford, and the circuit rider would not come through again until March, and Corwin did not believe, that morning, that words spoken over the grave would change anything about what was in it. He came back into the cabin on the second night after the burial, and he took down the leather satchel from the peg, and he opened it on the table, and he began, for the first time, to read. The notebook was the education of 40 years. It was written in a hand that grew smaller and steadier as the pages progressed, and it was organized not by date but by phenomenon. There were entries on the sound of ice, in different temperatures and different depths. There were entries on the way a river froze, from the banks inward and from the top downward, and on the false skin that formed when a warm wind laid a layer of melt above a layer of cold. There were entries on the specific behavior of the loop at the ford, on the way the current beneath the ice carried heat from the springs upstream and thinned the underside of the freeze in ways that no man walking on the surface could detect. There was, on page 41, a passage underlined twice, "The river will lie. It will show 4 inches of surface ice and hold nothing beneath. A boy will walk it and think it is safe. A man will drive a wagon and drown. The only test is the sound. Tap once. Listen for the answer. 2 clean strikes mean a solid column. 1 clean strike followed by a hollow return means a hollow river. Do not cross a hollow river. Do not let any man cross it. Do not argue. Do not explain. Simply stand at the ford and refuse to move, and let them go around you if they must." Corwin read that passage 3 times. Then he read it a 4th time. Then he sat back in the chair by the low fire, and he understood, all at once, what he had been part of. He understood the willow stick and the tapping and the years of laughter in the town. He understood why Ashel had said, "I was not wrong. I was early." He understood that the ice on the 21st of October had been solid, and that the warm wind of the 8th of November had made it hollow, and that Ely Marston, who had run the freight office for 11 years without losing a wagon at the ford, was going to put 9 wagons on a hollow river in 9 days. And that Bertram Coyle would be on one of them, because Coyle drove the number 3 team, and that the boy, Isaac Marston, would be walking ahead with his testing pole, because the boy always walked ahead. Corwin closed the notebook. He put it back into the satchel. He put the satchel back on the peg. He went to bed and did not sleep. And in the morning he did something that a boy of 17 has almost no capacity to do, which is act on a certainty that no one else in the world shares. He hitched the mule to the cabin's small work sledge. He loaded onto it a bundle of long stakes he cut from the standing dead cottonwood behind the smokehouse, a coil of tarred rope, a hammer, and the willow stick. He rode down to the ford. He drove the stakes into the frozen ground of the north bank in a line 30 feet back from the water, and he strung the tarred rope between them at chest height, and he tied to the rope a strip of red flannel he had taken from one of Ashel's shirts. Then he took the willow stick out onto the ice, and he tapped it at the center of the ford, and he listened. 1 clean strike. Then a hollow return. He tapped it 3 feet to the east. Same result. He tapped it 3 feet to the west. Same. He walked the whole width of the ford and tapped it every 3 feet, and every single tap gave him the same answer, which was the sound of a river that looked solid and was not. He stood on the north bank with the willow stick in his hand, and he waited. The first wagon of the freight run was not scheduled until the 26th. He had 9 days. He decided he would stand at the ford every one of those 9 days and refuse to move, the way the notebook told him to. And he decided also that this would not be enough, because he was 17 and the town knew him as the boy who had laughed at Bertram Coyle's joke about the mud. He rode into town that afternoon. He went to the freight office. He stood in front of Ely Marston's desk, in the same place Ashel had stood 2 days before, and he said, "Mr. Marston, my uncle is dead. He died the night before last. Before he died, he told me the ice at the ford is hollow, and I went down there this morning, and I tested it with his stick, and I can tell you that he was right. Please do not cross on the 26th. Marston looked at him for a long time. Marston was not a cruel man. He had liked Ashel Vane in a distant way, and he was sorry to hear of his death, and he said so. Then he said gently, because he was speaking to a boy who had just lost the only family he had, "Corwin, your uncle was a good man in his own way, but he was wrong about the river more times than he was right. And my boy walked on the ice this morning, and it is solid, and we will cross on the 26th. He was not wrong about the river," Corwin said. "He was early. There is a difference." Marston did not laugh. He looked at Corwin with something that might have been pity and might have been discomfort, and he said, "Go home. Bury your uncle. Come see me in the spring." Corwin went home. He did not bury his uncle again. He sat by the fire, and he read the notebook a second time, all the way through. And this time he made notes of his own in the margins, small ones, in pencil, because he did not want to mark the old man's pages more than he had to. He learned, in that reading, the second thing that would save his life. The notebook had a section, near the back, titled only with the word load. It described, in the same small square handwriting, the load-bearing geometry of a river crossing over hollow ice. It said that a hollow river would not fail all at once. It would fail in sequence. The lightest load would cross first. The second load would cross on ice already weakened by the first. The third load might or might not cross. By the fourth, the ice would give, and it would give at the point of greatest weight, which was always the center of the ford, and it would give downstream first because the current worked the underside of the ice from downstream to upstream. A wagon at the center of the crossing when the ice gave would go down whole. A wagon behind it would go down as the ice folded. A wagon ahead would have perhaps 20 seconds to reach the far bank. The notebook said, in the same underlined double-lined way as the earlier passage, "If they will not listen, and they will not, then the only remaining kindness is to prepare the near bank for what will come out of the water. Ropes, long poles, a fire, dry blankets, a place where a wet man can be brought back to warmth before his heart stops. Do not try to save the wagons. Save the men." Corwin read that passage, and he sat very still for a long while, and then he stood up and he began to work. He worked for 6 days. He did not stop except to sleep 4 hours a night and eat what was already cooked in the pot. He cut and hauled 12 long cottonwood poles, each 15 feet long, and he laid them along the north bank of the ford in a stack. He built 2 fires, one at each end of the bank. In pits he dug down to bare earth and lined with river stone, and he laid dry hardwood beside each pit under oilcloth. He brought down from the cabin every blanket he owned, and every one of Ashel's, and he stacked them in a cedar chest he dragged out on the sledge and set between the 2 fire pits. He coiled 100 feet of good rope and hung it from one of the stakes. He drove more stakes, this time on both banks, and he strung more rope between them, so that a man in the water, half frozen and blind with panic, would find something to grab no matter which way the current turned him. He worked in a cold that dropped to 20 below on the 22nd, and did not rise above 0 for 3 days. His hands cracked and bled inside his mittens. His face burned and then went numb and then burned again when he warmed it at the fire. He did not stop. On the evening of the 25th, he rode into town one last time. He did not go to the freight office. He went to the general store, and he stood in the door with his hat in his hands, and he said to the men on the porch and inside the store, men who had laughed at Ashel and at him, "Tomorrow at the ford, the ice will give. I have set ropes and fires on the north bank. If you have a strong back and a warm coat, and you are willing to be wrong in front of your neighbors, come stand with me at dawn." No one answered him. Bertram Coyle was there, leaning against the counter, with a piece Phapes of horsehound candy in his cheek, and he looked at Corwin, and he almost said something, and then he did not. The store went quiet, the way a room goes quiet when a boy says a thing that the men in it do not know how to answer. Corwin waited a moment longer. Then he put his hat back on and he walked out. He had his hand on the door of the shop, half open into the cold, when he thought about turning back. He thought about telling them again. He thought about begging. He stood there for a long moment, and he heard from behind him no sound at all. No laugh, no word, no movement. and he understood that silence was its own answer, and that it was not the answer he had hoped for, and that it would have to be enough. He rode home. He slept 2 hours. He was at the ford before first light on the 26th of November, 1874, with the 2 fires already lit, and the ropes checked, and the blankets stacked, and the willow stick in his hand. The freight train came down the trail from the north at sunrise. 9 wagons, 63 mules, 15 drivers, and the boy Isaac Marston walking ahead with his pole. Ely Marston rode at the head on a gray horse. When he saw the fires on the near bank and the ropes strung along it, and Corwin standing at the water's edge with the willow stick, he pulled up his horse, and he looked for a long time, and he did not speak. Behind him, the wagons rolled to a stop one by one, and the drivers climbed down, and the men gathered on the south bank in a rough half-circle, and no one said anything, because there is nothing a grown man will say to a boy of 17, who has set up a rescue station at a crossing the grown man has already decided to make. Marston finally rode down to the water. He looked across at Corwin. He said, "Across the ice. Boy, move aside." Corwin did not move. "I will not tell you again." "Send the boy across first," Corwin said. His voice cracked, and he hated that it cracked, but he steadied it, and he said the next part was clean. "Send Isaac with the pole. Let him walk to the middle. Let him tap the ice with the pole. If it rings solid, cross. If it rings hollow, turn back." Marston looked at him. He looked at his son, who was 12 years old and standing on the south bank, with his pole in his hand and his eyes very wide. He looked at the ice. He looked at the fires on the nearby bank, and at the blankets stacked in the cedar chest, and at the ropes hanging from the stakes. He said, "Isaac, walk to the middle. Tap it with the pole." The boy walked. Corwin watched him. The boy reached the middle of the ford, and he lowered the pole, and he tapped the ice with it. Once, and the sound came back across the river in the still cold air, and every man on both banks heard it. One clean strike. Then a hollow return. The boy looked at his father. His father looked at Corwin. Corwin did not say anything. He did not have to. Marston sat on his gray horse for perhaps 10 seconds without moving, and then he turned in the saddle and he shouted at the men behind him, "Back the teams. Back them off the trail." We rode upstream to the shoal crossing. Now, they did not all get back in time. That is the thing the county remembered afterward, and the thing the newspapers in Omaha printed for weeks. 7 of the wagons turned around on the south bank and rolled north along the water to the shoal, crossing 3 miles upstream, which was slower and rougher, but not hollow. 2 of the wagons, the number 3 team, driven by Bertram Coyle, and the number 7, driven by a man named Elias Prine, did not turn. Coyle, Corwin would learn later, had already been on the ice when the pole struck hollow. He had walked out ahead of his team to lead the mules across, and he was 30 feet onto the surface, and when he heard the sound he ran the wrong way, back toward his wagon, instead of forward toward the near bank. Prine's team, spooked by the shouting, bolted onto the ice behind Coyle's. The river gave at the center of the ford about 40 seconds after the boy tapped it. It did not crack the way ice cracks in stories. It settled. It sagged in the middle in a long, slow sigh, and then it opened, and the 2 wagons and both teams went down into the black water together, all at once, as though the river had been waiting for exactly that wait, for exactly that long. Corwin was already running. He had the first rope in his hand before Marston was off his horse. He threw it, and it landed short, and he pulled it back and threw it again. And this time Bertram Coyle, in the water up to his neck, and going white in a way that had nothing to do with the light, caught it with a hand that could barely close. They pulled Coyle out. They pulled Prine out. They pulled a mule out by driving 3 long cottonwood poles under its shoulders and levering it onto the ice shelf, though the mule died an hour later on the bank. They did not pull out the wagons. The wagons were gone. The window glass, the salt pork, the iron stock, the flour, all of it went down the loop and was not seen again, though a farmer near the confluence of the Platte, in the spring, would find a single unbroken pane of the hotel glass wedged in a driftwood snag 6 miles downstream, and would keep it his whole life without ever explaining why. They brought the 2 men up to Corwin's fires on the north bank. They stripped the wet clothes off them. They wrapped them in dry blankets. They held them close to the flame, 1 man on either side of each, until the shivering began, which was the sign that the body had not yet given up. Coyle's shivering started after 11 minutes. Crying took 23. Both men lived. Corwin worked at the fires without speaking. He did what the notebook had told him to do. He did not look at Ely Marston, who sat on a stump 3 feet from the second fire, with his hat in his hands and his head down, and did not speak either. He did not look at Bertram Coyle, who lay wrapped in 3 of Ashel Vane's old blankets and stared at the sky and said once, very quietly, "I heard the sound. Corwin, I heard it." "I did not know what it meant," Corwin said. "I know." That was all he said. It was the 7th word he had spoken all morning. He did not go home that night. He stayed at the fires until the men were warm enough to walk, and then he helped load them into the wagon Marston had brought back from the shoal crossing to fetch them. And he watched the whole freight train ride south with 2 fewer wagons, and every man on it changed in some small way from the man he had been at dawn. He put out the fires. He rolled the blankets. He coiled the ropes. He rode home on the mule in the dark, and he found the cabin cold, because he had not banked the fire before he left, and he built it up again from the 3rd crib of kindling. The last one, the one Ashel had stacked without telling him why, and he ate a bowl of cold stew, and he went to bed. He slept for 14 hours. When he woke, it was the 27th of November, and he was still 17, and he was not the same boy he had been on the 26th. The winter that followed was long and hard, and Corwin lived through it in the cabin above the loop by doing what the notebook told him to do, 1 page at a time. He tapped the ice at the ford every 3 days through December and January, and he wrote down what he heard, and he added his own small entries to the back of the notebook in his own pencil hand. He learned the way the river froze and the way the springs upstream carried heat in patterns he could predict once he had seen them twice. He learned the sound of a solid column and the sound of a hollow one, and he learned, more slowly, the difference between a river that was lying and a river that was only resting. He learned other things, too. He learned that the chaff in the north wall of the cabin was there because still air is the best insulator a man can make without spending money, and that the trench of ash and sand was there because it stopped the frost from reaching the wall's foundation and pulling heat out through the ground. He learned that the 3 lengths of kindling were 3 lengths, because the first was for autumn fires, when the flue was cool and needed a fast catch. The second was for deep winter, when the fire had to burn slow through the night. And the third was for the specific week in February, when the sap in the standing wood began to move, and the smoke drew differently. He learned all of this by reading and by testing and by standing in the cold with a willow stick in his hand and listening. And he did not learn any of it in time to thank the man who had known it first. That was the part that stayed with him, not the loss of the wagons, not the men he had saved. The fact that Ashel Vane had died 6 days before the vindication, and would never know that the boy who had laughed at Bertram Coyle's mud joke had, in the end, done the thing right. In the spring, when the ice went out and the loop ran high and brown, Corwin walked down to the ford one morning with the willow stick in his hand. He stood on the north bank and he looked at the water. He tapped the willow stick against the packed earth of the bank in the old rhythm. Once, wait, twice, wait longer. And he listened, and he heard only the sound of a spring river doing what a spring river does, which was to run. He said, aloud, to no one, when a river lies, it lies quietly. He was not talking to anyone. He was not performing. He was speaking a sentence that had lived in his head all winter and had finally found its way to his mouth, and the moment he said it, he understood it. Not as a puzzle solved, but as a room he had finally been given the key to walk into. He stood there for a while. He did not smile. He nodded once, the way Ashel had nodded at things that satisfied him, and he turned and walked back up the shelf to the cabin. The town of Larkspur Ford did not build a monument to Ashel Vane. Frontier towns rarely built monuments to men who had been right about things the town had preferred to be wrong about. But Ely Marston, in the spring of 1875, walked out to the cabin on the shelf above the loop with his hat in his hand, and he stood in front of Corwin at the door, and he said, I would like to learn what your uncle knew, if you will teach me. Corwin looked at him. He was 18 years old now. He thought for a long moment. Then he opened the door wider, and he stepped aside, and he said, Come in. That was how it began, though it is not the story here, and it does not matter for the ending. What matters is the willow stick, which Corwin Hale kept until his own death in 1931, and which was found in his effects by a granddaughter who did not know what it was. What matters is the notebook, which was donated to the County Historical Society in 1948, and which is still there in a glass case open to the underlined passage about the sound of hollow ice. What matters is the ford, which is not used as a crossing anymore because a bridge was built in 1902, but which is still called Vane's Cut by the people who live nearby, though few of them can say why. Wisdom doesn't always arrive in time to be thanked. But it arrives. If this story stays with you, the next one is already waiting.